Tonight, we're going to look at the 4 blocks of Franklin that really was the heart of the business district. And one Saturday, I came in like normal to work, and I didn't really have anything to do that morning, so I started picking up my books, session books that I have for almost 20,000 photographs. And I was flipping through them and looking, and I said, I think I've got enough photographs of all the buildings on Main Street that I need to do something. And so I started. We're starting off with this great color postcard that I've used. Some of you all are not, I don't think anyone's here old enough to remember when it looked like this, but remember the 4 blocks of Franklin are very special. And I give a little induction here telling about the importance of these 4 blocks. And I've said once, and I'll say again, downtown Franklin has not looked as good as it does in 223 years. And it's because of a small group of people made the difference. And we'll talk about that later. And you know who you are that work hard in the field. Okay. This is the earliest photograph that I have found. In the mid-1880s, a photographer named Schul came to town to do photographs of the battlefield. And I have not found any of them. There is one of, he went up to Winstead Hill and took a photograph from up there, and then this one of the square. Unfortunately, the 2 buildings that you see, house is corner on one side and the McGavick building on the other, are no longer there. But this gives you, notice how level and clean the square is. Of course, it was unpaved, and I'm sure it got muddy when it rained. So we've come a long ways there. Here are 4 postcards that show almost taken in the same spot, showing each end of Main Street from the square down to Fifth Avenue. And particularly important, I think, is the old Williamson County Bank that is, at one time, all the buildings on Main Street, on the square, were at a diagonal. They all opened in that, and only 2 today, I think, do that. Okay. This is an undated photograph, and I don't know what the parade's all about, but it gives you a real sense of what parades were like in Franklin. I think you're going to see a large amount of parades down Main Street, because not only you get a picture of the parade, but you get a picture of the buildings in the background. And here, let's start up, if you all remember where the old Williamson County Bank was, today Mellow Mushroom. And then come down, we had the Buford Brothers, which was a dry goods store. Then Mr. Joe Mendelson was in the next building. And then you'll see their city market, our city meets, and that was Mike Haggerty. And of course today, that is called the Franklin Square. It's that building has been refaced, and we have the businesses there of Mellow Mushroom and Johnny Q and Rock, Paper, Scissors. And they are doing well on Main Street. Here is the old Williamson County Bank, and there is a portrait up there of James Harrison. And he really was the big economic engine after the Civil War and on up until his death in the early 20th century. He was the founder of the Williamson County Bank, and he had his hands in a lot of properties on the street, as we'll see later down the block. But the board of the bank in the 60s 1963 decided to improve the building, and this is a great example that money and taste do not always come together. But most anything done in the 60s were not very tasteful. So that's That's good. And if you look at the first picture there with the old bank, right beside it, you'll see Draper and Darwin. They were in that building after the Buford brothers. So they later, you'll see, moved across the street. This is a picture of the Buford brothers. They were having a Buster Brown day. And if you all remember, Buster Brown was a famous shoe for children. The swastika, it's really not the Nazi swastika because it's on an angle. But I found this in an old newspaper, and I thought, well, we need to use that because the Buford Brothers was kind of one of the dry goods stores in Franklin. I love this picture because this parade shows us Beasley's, which took over from when Mr. Joe Mendelson left town. You have, and then Rose's next door. How many in here remember Rose's? Can anybody tell me when they went out of business? I've asked. It has to be around 1960. I had someone to tell me they bought their picture frames there, and they went to get a picture for their son, and he was born in 1960. So then you'll see the parade again. The rodeo parade has been a mainstay in this town, and it's looked forward to every spring. This picture is wonderful. Jim Chapman's grandson, Jim, lives in North Carolina. Jim Chapman, had the pie wagon on the square for 25 years. And so Jim occasionally cleans out some of his grandfather's material, and he'll send it to me. And I love this picture because it was taken in 1933, the Armistice Day. The wagon or the taxi cab you see in front today was Uncle Harry Marsh, who was the last to run a horse and a cab. And thanks to Calvin Lehue, you can go to the county archives today and see that cab. It's there thanks to our good friend Calvin Lehue. If you'll notice, the car has an emblem on the front, the Blue Eagle, which was the NRA. When Franklin Roosevelt put in those first 100 days of his administration in 1933, that was a symbol to help businesses and keep price controls. And Williamson County and Franklin had 100% cooperation. They signed, and they had the Blue Eagle. Later it was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but it was popular in Franklin. The group behind it is the BGA boys are in the parade. The newspaper said that there were 10,000 people at this parade in 1933. But I love to see the background. You're seeing the buildings that are no longer there today in that shape. Richard Jordan was a marvelous historian, and he collected so many things, and he gave me these two photographs that he took. And he said on Saturday nights, he would bring his children down on the street and park across from the Shamrock, and they would watch the fights. That was their entertainment on Saturday night. And here you have, I know some of y'all remember Mr. Elmer Peach, who was a city policeman, and he's taking Willie, I think that's Skidmore. He's taken too much fluid, and so he's carrying him down to the jail to spend the night. Now, when the city had one cell down there in the corner of the square, and when that got full, they took them down to my office at the old jail, 112, and we had a drunk tank there that the boys would spend the weekend for imbibing too much. Here is the Warwick brothers came here about 1901 and had two buildings. It would have been where Joe Mendelson's building, and then the two buildings, the Warwick brothers had two saloons there. And then they built a distillery on 11th Avenue and Boyd Mill Pike. And then, of course, in 1905, the state of Tennessee, legislature has been passing all kinds of little regulations so that alcohol would not be sold in town. And so the city of Franklin submitted their charter so that they could rewrite the law saying that there'd be no saloons in Franklin. So it wasn't until, Bennett's Corner under a good friend of ours got liquor by the drink. And so we have restaurants today in Franklin that are kind of making more money than they would if they was just serving food. Franklin has always been a town that did not back away from a drink. In that same spot, after the Womacks had to leave, first maybe it was Anthony Formosa came in, and then he sent down Joe Scalata to take his place. And Joe lived with his family upstairs and then sold fruit and vegetables down below. And this is, you can see his truck there. It's really a car I think's been converted over into he's selling probably door to door besides that. But it's kind of interesting that here you had the Joe Mendelson, the Scolati, and then the Torner family. So you had 3 immigrant families, 2 Jewish and 1 Italian, and they got along just fine. If you look at the history of Franklin, there were not many foreigners that came into town. There were several Jewish families that we can talk about later, but Scolati was one of the few Italians. Mr. Edward Ragsdale had his jewelry store, and some of y'all may know he was doing well, had 4 children, and he died and left his wife to raise the 4 children. She tried to keep the jewelry store going, but it just didn't work. And of course, Clyde Redford worked for them as a watchmaker and repair. If you all know Nancy Berry, she was the oldest, and she's the only one living out of that family today. And she's, I think, 99. The Torner family. Abraham and Flora, she was a sugarman, and they came to Franklin in the 1880s from Poland. And Abraham's name was not Torner. That's the only name spelled that way. Of course, when you went into Ellis Island or wherever you entered the United States, they would write down and almost give you a name if it was, like this long. And that's what happened to the Torners. But it's such a remarkable family. The Torner store was here for 78 years. Anna died, and Mr. Joe Posnack was a brother-in-law, and he took over the store for a little while, and then he sold his business and Torner store. But their son, Martin, was probably one of the most popular men in the county, particularly among young boys who had animal skins to sell, because Mr. Torner would buy them and then crate them and send them to Chicago to get a higher price. He also bought walnuts and scrap metal, and then he got into the tomato and green bean production. Particularly the first district benefited greatly from Martin Torner, because he provided them with the fertilizer, the seed to grow the beans, grow the tomatoes, and then he gave them a guaranteed price of what they would get. And he would ship them, ice them down, and send them to Chicago and get a better price here. Also, they were 3 daughters, and they all succeeded in business. This is a picture that's almost unbelievable. This was beside the courthouse and behind the Torner store. 1917-18, of course, was World War I, and there was a big demand for scrap metal. So Martin would go around and buy up farm equipment, and you see there's rake wheels and all, and then he would load that up and send it on a train to get a good price for it. And then you see there's Martin with some of his animal skins. His business was on both ends of 2nd Avenue, down by the depot. That was his office, and then later he had the scrapyard, which is behind our building, the old jail, at the end of 2nd Avenue. Really a great citizen. He had his wife was so active in the social clubs here, and she was a strong supporter of the public library. Bob Schaefer, if you all remember him, he was such a great guy. He came here from Murfreesboro and converted some old buildings where the Torner store was and where a liquor store was, and turned that into Beatty's. Now, this is before Office Depot and all that came to town. He was the guy you went to buy boxes or cases of paper, ink for your printer, and just a marvelous guy. Staples, it was a school supply heaven, poster board. And here you see in the center is Miss Hazel Torner Posnack, and she's being interviewed because the front of that building has been taken off, and you get to see the old Victorian building in the background. And then on the backside, when Anthropology was doing their remodeling of the building, on the back you could see where Torner's had parking. There was a lot of parking behind that part of, because of the courthouse, and there was free parking for the Williamson County Bank, and a lot of people used that. BGA has a contest each year called the Tug of War, and I suspect the Greers lost the tug of war, and they're sweeping the streets. But you'll notice the buildings in the background are kind of interesting. You'll see Wilkerson's, at that time, was a furniture store. Later it became a hardware store when I came to town. Mr. Rusty Wilkerson and Lou ran that. What's important about that particular site is we believe that was where the Bell Tavern was. John Bell, of course, practiced law here, and he and his father developed Belltown, which is from the post office all the way up to Folk Street on Columbia Avenue. So it was a whole new subdivision. It was second to Hinchyville. But he's important historically because he was our representative in the state. Then he went to Congress, he was Speaker of the House, he was Senator, and he ran in the 1860 election and carried 3 states, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. And of course, he lost to Abraham Lincoln. This one I just added in because I'd forgotten about it, but the Richardsons, R.L. and Stokely, and of course you all know Bob Richardson, who was a lawyer on the square, they ran a store in there probably about next to Torner's. And in 1934, they left there and went over to Fifth Avenue next to Thomas McCall's electric company and ran that for a while. And then finally, there was just so much competition, as you're going to see in the grocery stores. They're just amazing how many grocery stores were here, in and out. Here we have the Franklin High School Band in 1956. And you can see over to the side, Wilkerson's Hardware, Thurman's Grocery, Ewing Supply Company, and then H.G. Hill. Those little buildings in there seem to be the sweet spot for shoppers. And you're going to see why in a minute. Notice that the cars there are parked parallel, and we'll get into that because I just found out I found something today that I know I need to make some corrections here. Percy Jeanette was a World War I veteran. When he came back, he married Julia Isaacs, and they started Jeanette's Market. And you can see Mr. Percy back there. He was in charge of the meat counter. And there's a sign in the back you may not realize, but even when I came to town in 1970, Wednesdays at noon, Main Street closed down. And you opened on Saturday. And so you'll see a sign there saying that they will be closed at noon on Saturday. And then next over, some of y'all remember Fred Isaacs. He was a brother-in-law, and he, at this time, had just come back from the service. And he's working for his brother-in-law and sister. But what's pointing out there, it wasn't until 1952 that the grocery stores had self-service. H.G. Hill started that. Before that, if you wanted, you had to come in and write down what you wanted, and give it to one of the boys, and they went around and did your shopping for you, and you'd pick it up after doing your shopping down Main Street. And then Hills came up with that novel idea. Some people may like to pick out what they want. Oh, look at Ed Thurman. He was the last grocer on Main Street. And goodness, I wish we had one now. I know they probably couldn't make any money paying the rent, but it's so many times we just go get something quickly, it'd be nice. But in 1947, Ed and Horace Edgman took over Jeanette's, and Ed before that had been manager of H.G. Hills for 25 years. My father-in-law in the 8th grade started working for Ed so he could go to the elementary school instead of Lipscomb Elementary, and Ed would have him deliver groceries in the truck. And Mr. Oscar Garner would stop and he said, "Now, Ed, you know you're not old enough to drive, and tell Ed not to make you drive." And so he'd go back, and Ed said, "Oh, okay." And then a week later, he'd be out running the road again. So much for law. You know, Franklin was a small little town, and everybody knew everybody, and so you could get by with things, or you couldn't get by with things, but in that case, they did. This picture came to me just by James Redford had a friend that lived in Lebanon, and she was akin to the Morris, and she brought me this picture. And I knew it was Main Street. I couldn't figure out where. And one day I was walking from the post office back to the jail, and I happened to notice right there at the registry and the white mercantile building, those iron posts, fluted, very decorative. And I said, "That's it." So I went back and got my picture, and sure enough, everything fit. And this, of course, was in the Moore building. Mrs. Moore was a daughter of Robert Bradley, who had a large family in Franklin, and she built that building in 1893. And later, Newt Cannon, who would have been Mr. Sam Fleming's grandfather, he was a Governor Newton Cannon's grandson, and he opened a store there next. You'll notice in the background there is priest, undertaker. And Mr. Henry Priest lived down on 2nd Avenue next to where Rudy Jordan lives. And this picture is just wonderful. Now, W.J. Beasley came from down on Lick Creek, came to Franklin and opened up this store in 1903. And then his son, later, Mr. Frank Beasley, had Beasley's store there. Then when Joe Mendelson left, Beasley left this building and went down the street towards the bank. And then, oddly enough, Piggly Wiggly came to town and was in that spot. And of course, H.G. Hill. H.G. Hill was all over Nashville, and then he started branching out into places in the counties around Nashville. And this store was 1925, and they were there until 1964 when they moved up to the Franklin Plaza on Columbia Avenue. they were the ones that started the self-service, as I mentioned. And you'll see this crew, how many it took to operate that grocery store. Of course, they weren't paying them anything much. I don't know, it was very little. Ed Ladd said that they would work from 7 o'clock on Saturday morning to 12 o'clock at night. Mr. Ed had a system, Ed Thurman had a system. Of course, during this period of the 30s and 40s, sugar was regulated and rationed. And if you bought so much sugar, you had to sign for it. So Mr. Ed Thurman had a system. Anybody that came in that store automatically bought 20 pounds of sugar. And then on Saturday night, Mr. Dyke Bennett from out at Little Texas would come and back his wagon up to the store and load his wagon down with sugar. Franklin has not always been a law-abiding town. And here's Piggly Wiggly. This is 1934. You can see you've got H.G. Hill on the corner, Piggly Wiggly, Jeanette's, or later Thurman's. On down the street would have been Richardson, and then on down past that would have been A&P. Now, how could they make any money with that much competition? And then we're going to see across the street Brothers Grocery, McCall's Grocery, Johnston and Dozier. I don't see how they made any money. You can see they're coming in, they last a month or so, and then they're gone. This is, I think, a good photograph showing you those stores. This is right before a streetscape. And some of y'all will remember Bruce Upholstery took over the Rusty Wilkerson's hardware store. And then later, even today, Tom Taylor and Tom Jones and Reed Street had their offices there. I think Reed's missed, and of course, Tom Taylor is a judge, so he's got offices in the courthouse. But H.G. Hill is there on the corner. That's a prime spot. And since they left in '64, if you look in the newspapers, there were a shoe store, ladies' wear, just one after the other. And today we have the Registry, which is a rather upscale house furnishings. And here's the Moore Building again. It's you can see before the one on the corner where Hills was, Shoe Stop, is painted white. Now, thank goodness you can't do that today because we have historic zoning that would regulate that. And so I took a picture to show you what it looks like today. And those buildings are much prized. I think they really set a flavor for our town. And then, of course, in 1955, BGA, instead of having it down at the river, at the bridge, they did it on Main Street. And of course, the boys didn't get wet. And the crowds could enjoy it more because being on the bridge and up and down the bank was not very good for the public. But here, I think it looks very well. And of course, you can see in the back on the building is H.G. Hills. And it looks like it was painted white then. Okay. But no, see, I think there. Okay. I love this picture. And you old-timers, old Franklin's going to look at this and pick out their favorite store. It's just amazing. If you're over on the left-hand side, you'll see, of course, Frank's was there. And, of course, then we go on down. London Garner, that was the shoe store. Been there forever. And the Franklin Jewelry, and unfortunately Gail couldn't be with us tonight, but her mother and father ran the Franklin Jewelry store after Mr. C.C. Brees sold it, and we're going to see about him in a minute. And then, of course, going up the street, the sign of Gray Drug is still there today. It's not the same sign, but it's you know that. And of course, across the street, you can see maybe it's not so good with with some of the signs. But now this is back to Mr. Newt Cannon had one price only, and the only thing I can think of is that he wasn't going to negotiate. If he said he wanted 5 cents a pound for sugar, that's what you had to pay. And of course, this is a picture that I see Fleming Wiltz here tonight, but his grandfather was one of my favorites, and this is a picture of Miss Cannon, Miss Fleming, and their oldest daughter, Alice. But notice the sidewalks, how they slanted, and this is cut stone, so at least you wouldn't get your feet muddy. But Franklin was a nasty time during wet weather, as you can imagine. Then the next picture I want to point out to you, this is in front of Mr. Newt Cannon's store, and in particular in the center is Mr. Perkins Cannon. And he was the father of Henry Cannon, Jenny West, and Alice Patterson. Now, Mr. Henry Cannon is important because he was the husband of Ophelia House, Collie Cannon, Miss Minnie Pearl. So Minnie Pearl has great connections here in Franklin because her parents lived here, grew up here, and then they went to Centerville in the lumber business. And of course, Mr. Henry Cannon's family goes all the way back to the Revolutionary soldier of the Cannon family out at Tryon. I love this picture. 1952, again, the Franklin Band is marching, but look at what you see in the background on the side over there. Ed Thurman and Edgman is still there. He later starts a grocery store out Columbia Avenue, probably around where Highland, James Street in that area, I think. And then, of course, you got H.G. Hill, Bennett Hardware across the way, and the Variety Store, and then Jacobs Department Store. I was reading in the newspaper where in the late 40s, after the war, Jacobs Department Store was there. I started asking every old person in town, where was Jacob? Nobody knew. And I just happened to, when I got this photograph, it was next to Bennett Hardware. And then, of course, Harpeth Ford, and then you can get on down, you can probably see the marquee of this building. All right, this is an important, down at the corner of 4th and Main here on this side of the street, was known as Briggs's Corner. And Isaac Briggs' daughter, Annie, married Mr. James Harrison. And they tore down the old store and her house, and he built what later became known as Bennett's Corner. And today it's 55 South, but at one time, if you all can remember, Choice's Restaurant, Marilyn, we're wanting you to go back. It was wonderful. And that building is really iconic. We're so glad that it's been saved, and it's really one of the buildings on Main Street. The Bennett Hardware, Mr. Walter Bennett and Mr. W.W. Campbell, which was Stuart Campbell and Jim Campbell's father, they started the hardware store. Then when the Harpeth Bank was formed, Mr. Campbell became the vice president, so he got out of the hardware business and left it to Mr. Walter Bennett. And of course, Jim Bennett was a fixture on Main Street. Unfortunately, he had polio as a child and he was wheelchair bound. He did make it to BGA, and I don't know how he managed the stairs, but I think the boys picked him up and carried him. But they were really the last word because it's so convenient in the center of the business district. Usually the farmers would come and sit around the stove while their wives on Saturdays did the shopping. So there was an old potbelly stove back there that ran in the wintertime, and it was a place to meet. Of course, it went out of business in the mid-'60s, and the Burke furniture, I think, was there when we came. You'll love this picture. This is either 63 or 64, and Ben Johnson last week, I was showing him the book. I gave him a book, and he looked at it and he said, "Oh, that's my dad." So this is Harpeth National Bank's car, and Pete Flaw is driving, and you'll see John Paul Johnson is with the shotgun, and I don't know who the others are, but this is the Clampetts, the Beverly Hillbillies. And of course, in the background, you see a great picture of Bennett Hardware, Mr. Begbie's Variety Store, and then 1 hour Martinizing. Can you believe that on Main Street? Now, another great story of a Jewish immigrant was Louis Brodsky. About 5 years ago, I got a call from a lady in Atlanta, and she called me, and she I don't know how she got my number, but she did. And she said that did I know a Louis Brodsky? And I said, well, I've seen his ads in the paper in the teens. And she said, well, that was my grandfather, and I want to come up and do some research. And I said, well, come on, I'll help you with whatever I can. So I met her down at the archives. It was in the basement of we were in the basement of the post office, and so it's been longer than 5 years. But anyways, she was wonderful, and she brought me some pictures of the family. But the story is so warm. Louis and his brother and nephew came to America right before the war started in Europe, I think 1913, and they worked their way down to Franklin, and some men in Nashville gave him some money to get a start here in Franklin. And he had the two buildings next door. Up. You have the Bennett's Hardware, and then the next buildings were Brodsky. And he apparently had a great sense of humor, and the town really patronized him. Well, after the war, in 1920, he had been accumulating money and borrowing money and trying to get enough money to send his brother and nephew back to Ukraine. It was Soviet Russia by that time. And they went, and the village that he was in, that their family was in above Odessa, and it was right in the terrible part of the White Russians and the Red Russians were killing one another, and particularly the Jews were being annihilated. And this family the town was burned, and they were out living in a gully. And so Jake Raskin and Brodsky's brother had to bribe every country to get out, and they finally made it to Britain, England, and they sent a telegram saying, we're out of money, and we got to get on a boat and go to New York. So Brodsky went around town and borrowed as much money as he could and wired it to Britain. And in a few months, he got a telegram that they were in New York. And so he got on a train very quickly and went to New York to get his family. And he comes back. Apparently, he must send a telegram that he's coming, because almost the whole town, I'm told, were down at the depot to welcome him. And the family gets off. There's about 15 in the bunch. And as they got off, supposedly the mayor gave Mrs. Brodsky a country ham, and she fainted. I guess our mayor wasn't very up on Orthodox Jewry. But the lady from Atlanta laughed about it. She said, they were treated well. The trouble was, after World War I, there was like a slip in the economy, because everything was going so well during the war for the farmers and the business people, because they not only were furnishing the American army, they were also trying to feed Europe. Well, after the war, there was a slump. And of course, now people were coming to Lewis wanting their money, and he just didn't have it. So he had to declare bankruptcy, and you'll see these great ads in the paper where he's almost giving it away to try to get enough money to get. So he ends up going to Nashville, and the Jewish society up there takes care of him, but he finally dies in 1950 as rather a broken man. But he was able to get his citizenship. He came here in 1913, and by 1917, he had his citizenship, and I saw in the tax records where he had paid the dollar poll tax so he could vote. So it's saying something about Franklin. Now, the 20s, the time, the Ku Klux Klan was going, and they were against Catholicism and the Jews and anybody that was foreign. But yet, the Jews here in Franklin seem to thrive, and that's good for, there we go. I recognize this building right next door. First, Mr. Ballard, C.M. Ballard was kind of one of those geniuses that came here to Franklin, and he was a person that could make anything. He had his own shop. Well, in this building next door, they were selling batteries and tires. And later, Mr. Walker, of course, started Walker Chevrolet, N.Y. Walker, and his wife Rose. Later, Mr. Ballard set up his shop over here on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Fair Street. And then he sold it to Dortch. All of his tools and everything he sold to Dortch Stoveworks so they could improve their shop there. But inside this building, of course, Parks Realty was there for a good while in this building, and you could see the whole structure, how they had the beams and these iron rods that supported the roof without having so many posts. It's a great picture. Matter of fact, these pictures were given to me by Louise Walker. And I talked to her last week, and she's doing well. Then, about a couple months ago, Mr. Johnny Smith, who took care of the city water and the streets, he was kind of ran the town on that end of it. But earlier on, he was a motorcyclist, and these group of men, they all had motorcycles. And then later, the Henrys and Gatlins took over Leon Evans' garage. And you could see the guys there. It's a Main Street service station, and they were open 24 hours a day. But, there was a filling station almost 2 to a block all the way through Franklin. The Walker Chevrolet had pumps. Of course, later, Hardcastle, we'll see that picture. And it was another competitive thing. You can't make money selling gas. I love this picture. This is our city policeman, and at that time, all the work was done walking. And Mr. Joe Lunn and John Walton were there in their uniform with their badge. But notice in the background the sign, Ladies' Restroom. It was difficult for anyone to come to town and spend the day, and you need to go to the restroom. The only public restroom in Franklin was at the courthouse. And so the filling station, that was one way to get people to patronize them. And so here they've got a room for restrooms. Later, the home demonstration club ladies in the county rented a room at on East Main Street behind there's a bank there today, Fifth Third. But in one of those rooms, they rented that so that women could come to town, go to the restroom, and it was a place to change the baby because, there were a lot of young babies coming on at this time. And that was their place it was really a restroom. Now, this picture is one of my favorites, and I have made a mistake. believe it or not. When you bought the book, you're going to see in this book, here's the story. In the book, you're going to see I have a date, 1946. Yes, Lewis Ida bought Harpeth Ford in 1946. This particular this photograph was taken in 1949, and it is not the opening of the store. It is, you remember how important it was when the new cars came out? So that's what they're selling. The new 1949 Fords have just been put on the market, and that's why all these people are there. He's having a big event. You see the light that flashed in the sky to draw people. And then, of course, again, you see Jacob's department store and the variety store, and then Bennett Hardware. It's great. It's a great picture. And, things in the background are important to pictures is what's up front. This is reminiscent of some of you old timers will remember the theater and, of course, the pool hall. And maybe y'all remember Mr. Eddie Norris. And you can see there Western Auto. And then you've got the dollar store, and then One Iron Merchandising, and then I think on the corner of that time, Burke Furniture was there. Today we have, of course, 55 South on the corner, and then we've got John Dee's and the great ice cream place, Kilwin's. So, and then of course Anthropology is. Anthropology is in that building. And then, of course, today, the little pool hall is now part of our stand up there for refreshments. And, of course, the marquee you can see is not the one that's there today. The pool hall was really a great place for young boys, if your mother didn't know you were there, and old men, because they got to socialize. And I think Mr. Norris ran a pretty clean building. Upstairs, though, was where there was a roving card game. The city police either knew it and didn't do anything about it, or it was just kind of turned a blind eye. But I've heard there were some great card games going on. Here's the picture of the pool hall. Jim Eddy, of course, was there for a long time before he moved down to West Main Street. Joe Miller was there earlier too in 41. When I came to town, it was the second time around. It was kind of like a secondhand store. Under something. She had some Kingfield connections. I forget what. Okay, here's great pictures. This building we're in opened in July of 1937. The marquee was outstanding, but Lane and I moved to Franklin in August of 1970. In July of 1970, they took off the marquee and put up, you'll see the next picture is disgusting. But look at the kids. Franklin was a great town to grow up in. I lived in the country, so I didn't get this advantage, but you could ride your bicycle down on Saturday morning, leave it on the curb, go in and watch the movie all day, and didn't have to worry about your bicycle being stolen. Great place. And then, of course, the Quonset hut, I guess. 1970, this was remodeled, and they changed the name to Franklin Cinema. And then again in 87, it was the front was changed into a canopy that wasn't as bad as before. Sometimes things in the 60s and 70s were just not very tasteful. Okay, this building is so wonderful. And I've recognized Emily McGidd because she gave the seed money for this building. And then we had others come along that paid. They were not only big givers, but they were little donors. People paid, I think, $250 for the. And so if you see Emily, you thank her. And of course, the Lehughes were involved. Mr. Aubrey Preston, of course, got it going. But think about this building. It was a rat hole when we came here, and you didn't want to come. The floor was sticky, where they hadn't mopped the floor. But to think they made this very simple building, this is a highlight of Art Deco architecture. And you see it out front. The marquee is back. And that's another thing. People's memories are bad. I went around asking everyone when we were trying to design the marquee, what color was it? I got green, blue, red. Nobody could remember. So finally, I had a photograph. I think it was 1959 or 60. It was a parade, the rodeo parade, and someone had a colored camera and took a picture of the marquee. And so that's where we got what it is today. But inside, this building's wonderful. The sound is so great. The movies here, the entertainment, it is a plus to this town. And again, it was a small group of people that made the difference. It grew, but it was that, small core, maybe 10 or 12 people that said, we're going to do this. And of course, you got to have some money, and it came together. This was a community project, but to get it started, it was a very tight group. And thank them. Here's again another parade. This is a 4-H parade. They used to have those every year. And of course, you see the theater, the way it looked. It's wonderful. They also had it fixed where if you wanted some popcorn and didn't come in, you could get Cokes and popcorn right there out the window. It was just a wonderful place. Isn't this a nostalgic view of Franklin? You're right there in front of the theater, and you can see the marquee. And then across the street, I want to draw your attention, it's the Dairy Whip. And that is Mr. Will Redmond. He had a liquor store and also had a cafeteria, a cafe. But the sad thing of it is, Williamson County and Franklin was a very segregated place until the late 60s. And if you were an African American, you sat in the balcony. And if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to cross the street and go over to Will Redmond's cafe to go to the restroom. There were two restrooms here, one for white women and one for white men. And we've come a long ways, haven't we? I love this photograph, and this photograph caused so much controversy when it first came out. And Guy Wallace is the one that settled it. When this picture surfaced, all the women in the 40s were telling you who they were. Oh yeah, that's so-and-so. And there's one in there that did look like Ann Trabue, Ann Rutherford. And so I said, well, maybe they're right. And then Guy Wallace, Jr., he said, oh no, he said, that was my mother and her girls coming down from St. Bernard's in Nashville. They got out of school and they came to Franklin in another car, and they were on their way to Willow Plunge. And so this is J.O. Walker Jr.'s car, Dr. Walker's son, Odie's father, and the girls piled up in there and had their picture made. So the girls in 1939 want to have fun just like the girls today. But in the background, look, you'll see Walker Chevrolet, and you'll see a Gulf sign, so they were selling gas. And later, Walker Chevrolet moved up Columbia Avenue, kind of out before you get, well, it's kind of across from the police station today. But But see, these kind of pictures really tell you so much in the background. Now, this was just 2 doors down. We have 423 Main. That was the Franklin Theater original, 1924 until 1937. And it seated 350 people. If you go down, Mr. Mosley will let you in to see his African art, but he lives upstairs, and that was the balcony. I think they floored it so it'll be full, but to get 350 people in that little area is bound to be hot in the summer. This building, by the way, was the first air-conditioned building in Franklin. It wasn't very cool. They had water tower back here, and a fan blew through it, and that was supposed to cool you off. And you get this place held 600 people downstairs, and I think there was 130 in the balcony for the African Americans. And I imagine it got pretty hot in here. Leonard Isaac says you didn't want to eat a chocolate candy bar. Anyways, maybe you all remember Herbert Bowen and Ruth, his wife. He ran for 30 years. He operated this building. And of course, if you know Linda Moore, that Ruth is her aunt. And Ruth was in Claiborne Hughes about the same time Dr. Rosalie was, and so I would go by and speak to Miss Crowell and Ruth often, and because talk about a sister, she went every day to see that her sister got fed, and she took her clothes home and washed them. It was just they were just great sisters. Okay. Walker Chevrolet moved, and then in 1948, Mr. Loy Hardcastle came. And talking to Loy Jr. For coffee one morning, I was quizzing him about the operations there, and he was telling me the last month they sold 153 cars. And I misunderstood, and you'll read the book, it has 153 cars in a year. So that's a correction, but it was just my not hearing correctly. But this is an important site. Not only did they take in Walker Chevrolet, but they took in the old theater. And then the building next door we're going to see, Mr. Ernest Ball, and Frank's here. This is Frank's uncle, a great uncle. Ernest Ball was kind of a fixture on. He also sold vegetables, and he always had a sack of peanuts, and so the boys would go by and grab a handful of peanuts and kind of aggravate him. But he was later in what was the old theater. He had been in the building on the corner, and the Presbyterian Church owned that building, and they tore it down to build offices for Dr. Walker and Dr. Nolan, and Padge Beasley was the dentist. And of course, on the corner, we have the historic Presbyterian Church. Presbyterians started here in 1811, and their church was down on the other side of the old city cemetery, which would be on 3rd Avenue today. And in 1842, they left that building and built a building at 5 Points, and that building was torn down. The original was torn down, and then the one there you see with the cow in the front was built, and then it burned, and then the present building is there today. So it's one of our downtown historic buildings with a wonderful rock wall that was built in 1910, I think. But it's a beautiful building. I love this picture. Judge John Henderson, the John that just died, his father, in 1925 climbed up into the bell tower at St. Paul's and took a picture looking back towards the square. And I love the setting that you get. You got the water tower that was at the at the courthouse that provided the water pressure for the town. I think it held 100,000 gallons. It was built in 1905 when Franklin got water from Hillsborough, Kingfield, Garrison. I was in this stand when we were celebrating our 50th anniversary, and Barry asked me to, we were given a history of the Heritage Foundation, and Barry told me, she said, oh, liven it up a little bit, you know. So I had a slide that showed Roper's Knob and Chutes Knob, and I made the kind of off-color remark that every time I went down, coming the Nashville Highway into Franklin and saw the two mountains or two hills, it reminded me of Mother Nature on her back. Well, the first group, when I said it, you know, we had two meetings, and the first group, they hesitated. They didn't know to laugh or not. Well, then apparently the next hour, when we had the next group, they were, you know, had big dinners out and tents out front, and so apparently that first group must have told the second group, because they started laughing when I hit the slide. So I have. These two knobs are important because they are the highest. They're the highest elevation in Franklin. And the men were sitting around the coffee shop one day, I think down maybe at Great Drug, and they were all telling big tales. And they said, Thomas McCall said, well, I'm so old, I remember when Roper's Knob was a hole. And it's over I think it's 957 feet above sea level, and down at the courthouse, I think it's 630. So that's a big difference. So that is the highest point. And you must say the Heritage Foundation saved that hill, that knob. It was up for sale. A developer was looking at it. The state came in and said, we'll buy the top 5 acres, and the Heritage Foundation, I think it was $680,000, and that's when we got friends with Emily McGill, and she started working and raising the money, and the Heritage Foundation paid off the note and then gave the land to the city. And hopefully one day that'll be a park, because it's a great view. Once you get up on the top, you can see all of Cool Springs and look back and see Franklin. So let's hope the city does that one day. Here is I got some park supporters back there. I love this postcard, and when you look at it, what's missing? A traffic light. I'm pretty sure there was a traffic light there, but it was probably over, not in the crossways, but it was over. We can't see it. Because I think I saw somewhere in the newspaper it was talking about in like 1938 or something. Hillsborough Road was finished in 1939. That went from here to Grassland and on up. Before that, you couldn't go directly to Grassland. You had to either go Spencer Creek, go up Del Rio Pike, and cross the river that way. So, but that is the thought, isn't it? Today, that's a very busy intersection. It's treacherous sometimes to cross. And in this grate, here again is our 1957 Franklin High Band. And say something about, Franklin High Band has had a long tradition of excellence. They've won a lot of prizes, and justly so. But what also I'm interested in, if you look over there, you'll see Corner Drug, the Western Union. Now, we don't have Western Union anymore, but if you wanted to sell a telegram to someone, wire you some money or to wire money, you could go to the Western Auto. And then, of course, the Kitty Shop, which was the Posnacks, and I spoke to Joanne Posnack Fine this morning. I sent her a book last week, and she called me to thank me, and she's promised she's finally going into her mother's photographs that I'm itching to get my hands on. And then, of course, Hood's Liquor. Gerald Hood had the liquor store. And then Goodyear, which was Moody Tires, was next. Railroad Salvage was in there, and then, of course, Clyde Redford had a jewelry store, and then Baker Lane had a barber shop, and Wilson's Friendly Shoes. How many of y'all remember getting your shoes at Mr. Wilson's Friendly Shoes? And then, of course, Western Auto. Western Auto, we're going to see moved across the street over here when R.C. Alexander moved Harpeth Ford down on Fifth Avenue. Isn't this a lovely building? When I came, that's probably the way it looked. Yeah, it always had a lot of ads. You couldn't see the inside the windows. It was always full of that. And then, of course, they let you know it's Rexall Drugs. It's the orange hits you. But anyways, this building today, of course, is Starbucks, and I think Starbucks used Franklin as their first business in a historic setting. And I think it's been very profitable. They seem to be all over town now, so a lot of people are drinking their coffee. Mr. Jenkins took it over from the North brothers, were there. It's kind of a sad story. The White Building was built in 1923 for Dr. Sam White. I don't think Sam White got to use it because he died in 1923. And his idea was his offices was going to be over the drugstore. Now in Franklin, back in the day, a lot of the doctors were also druggists. There was more money to be made in medicine and pharmaceuticals than there were delivering babies. And so a lot of those guys gave up delivering babies and taking care of patients, and every one of them had a drugstore. And so I think that's what he had in mind. Unfortunately, he died, and the North brothers came in. And then, of course, there's a staircase that goes up, and some of you all remember Miss Daley Thompson taught dance up there and had cotillions and ballet and all those kind of things on that next floor. And then, of course, in the center would have been Hood's Liquor, and then the Moody brothers, Tire. And Mr. Ed Moody was one of the nicest people you can imagine. When we were at the post office, he got where he couldn't walk very well, and so he would come through our office and by my desk to go to the post office, and he always stopped and told me little bits of history. One of the things he said was that a lot of the men in town didn't want anyone to see him going into Hood's Liquor, so they would go in Moody's and go out the back door and come in the back door at Hood's Liquor and get their liquor. And he said then they'd come out with a little package, with a twisted brown bag, thinking nobody knew what they were carrying. He had a great sense of humor. He really was. And then the next building there, where you had the little bay window coming out, Dr. Odell was a dentist there, and you could sit in the chair and see the people on the street while he was grinding your teeth. And then, of course, downstairs, it went through many. I think Cooper had a jewelry store there, maybe when we came, but it had been a beauty shop for many, many, many years. And then you can see over the time how things have changed. The building, the owner is having to replace some of the white brick or glazed, and some of that glazing is coming off. And I talked to her a couple months ago about trying to remedy that. But there's Dr. Sam White, kind of died very young. And here's the Posnacks, Joe and Hazel, and they started their store in 1939, and he closed the store in 1969, so it was on Main Street for 30 years. And it was kind of an upscale children's store. They had nice shoes and clothing, and they, I think, made a pretty good living. They had 3 children. Al lives down in Spring Hill, Sissy lives in Nashville, and Joanne is the oldest, and she lives in Florida. And Mr. Ed gave me this picture, and I love it, that he and Tom were such great citizens of Franklin. Tom came here in 44. Ed was in the Pacific in the World War II, and he after the war came here, and they were really famous. They had a good ingredients. First of all, they gave good service, they were courteous, and they had quality. And they're still in business down here on Columbia Avenue. Of course, Tom died first, and then Mr. Ed passed away not too many years ago. But they were just the epitome of what you'd want businessmen to be: honest, courteous, and having good service. This building is across the street down here, and you'll notice, if you didn't know, the Gentry building was built by Dr. Gentry, and later Miss Susie, his daughter, owned the buildings. It was built in 1905. This photograph is taken in 1910, and I had someone tell me, well, is that the end of the building? Yes, because in 1910, when this picture was taken, the drugstore on the corner wasn't there. That was Mr. Robert Bradley's home, and he had a side yard that went all the way up to what is now the Gentry building. So all that white building you see that's in between there, that was his house. It sat right on the corner, and then he had a garden that not anyone in downtown Franklin had on Main Street. So he was the last of the townhouses on Main Street. Notice if you're in the middle of the block, be on that left-hand side of the street, you'll see the round opening. That was the livery stable, Mr. Blackburn. And then across the street, next door here, we have another building that has a round opening to it, and that's where Binks is today, Outfitters. Those were two of the four livery stables that were in Franklin. We had one down on East Main, and then Tom Cotton over on 3rd Avenue South. So I love this building because this photograph, because you see Main Street unpaved but clean, and some trees right in front of the Presbyterian Church. Okay, here are some more grocery stores. Owen Johnson is kind of, he was a real hero in a way, and he was one of those three men from Franklin that at the end of World War I got the bright idea that they could go capture the Kaiser. And Owen was one of those, Captain Tom Henderson and Mr. Dan Riley. I think Mr. Riley drove the car. But anyways, after the war, and Owen really never was well. He died rather young. He kept going to the Veterans Hospital in Memphis or up in East Tennessee. But anyways, his brother-in-law, Mr. Lee Dozier, who had quit farming in Brentwood and came out to Boyd Mill Pike, and the two of them ran the grocery store. And then many of y'all may remember Miss Kate Aiken. She worked on Main Street for many years. And then there's Owen and his wife. And then right next door was Luther McCall's grocery store. So you had two grocery stores right side by side. And today we've got Tzatziki's and Yara Acres. A.N.C. Williams. He is probably the most important black citizen, and we know more about him because when he died or before he died, the newspaper gave great coverage and interviewed him and talked about, he told his whole story. He was a slave and down around Spring Hill. He finally came to Franklin, and during the Civil War, he was able to repair shoes for the Union soldiers and was able to get a little money ahead of everybody else. And so after the war, he was able to establish a grocery store across the street. And then in 1900, the old building was torn down, and he built the building that's there today. And it stayed in the family until 1981. Mr. Will Redmond was a grandson. Now, I bet A&C Williams probably turned in his grave because he was a Church of Christ preacher and started Cumming Street Church of Christ. And Mr. Will Redmond had a liquor store and slot machines and jukeboxes, all the things that probably Mr. A&C Williams would not have approved of. Here in this picture, they're standing in front of their store, and they have Fred and Ostrander. And Ostrander was Mr. Fred Williams' father. He was named after his uncle. Mr. A&C Williams lived up on Columbia Avenue, had a nice home. I think he had 12 children, and they all either became teachers, doctors, really important people. Mr. Will Redmond was a fine businessman. His store caught on fire, as we're going to see here in this next. We'll get to that. Let's get into the building where the rare print shop is today. W.S. Rose ran a grocery store, another grocery store, for 38 years. He lived over on 3rd Avenue and Bridge Street, the great old brick house there today. It's a very red brick, but he lived there for 38 years. He fell and broke his hip, and he ended up having to give up the store. But now, this picture is so important because this was from Mr. Fred Williams, because his uncle, J.D. House, worked for Mr. Rose. And he was the porter and the delivery man. You can see the truck there. All the grocery stores, if you had going to make it in Franklin, you had to deliver the groceries to the customers if they didn't come in. J.D. Patton was the leader of the Patton Leather Kids, which was a musical band. And of course, J.D. lived over at the greenhouse on the corner of Church and 2nd Avenue. And his wife, Bobby, just died here, 15 years ago, I guess. And I remember walking by there one day, and she was in there playing the piano, and she was really playing the beating that thing. So. But there, and Fred Williams, the nephew, also played in the band. This is Monroe Young's barber shop. He was in several places on Franklin, but you'll notice over there the guy on the barber that's standing up on the left, that's Mr. Baker Lane, and he was kind of a novelty too. He lost his left hand, and he barbered, and he had a comb, and then he had a rubber band on his wrist, and so he was able to cut with one hand and comb with the other. But the guy in the chair is really the novelty. That is Mr. Lord Givens, and he's another child prodigy. He played the violin in the symphony. He was a great locksmith. And the great story is, Mr. Dorsey Crockett's store was on the square. It had been an old bank building, and inside the building was the bank vault. And he couldn't get it open. So he asked Lloyd, would he open the safe? Because he was a locksmith, and he said he could do it. Click, 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 open the thing up. And Lloyd said, that'd be $20. And Mr. Crockett was very tight with his money. He said, $20? I ain't paying that. So J.D. just shut the door. Now, another thing about Mr. Law, he had a drinking problem. And so his house was behind 4th Avenue Church of Christ in what the parking lot is today. And so he would get on a bender that would maybe last a week or two. And so when he ran out of whiskey, he would go over to Hood's liquor store and he made a key, and he would go in and get what he wanted, but he would write it down what he had gotten, and then he would pay Gerald Hood whenever he got off his bender. So he was a novelty, but they say he was a genius in anything that he tackled. And it's interesting. I'm glad, that's the only picture I've seen of him. I've heard about him ever since I've been to Franklin. This is unusual. They're fixing the water line on Main Street, and of course there's no backhoes back then, and this is pick and shovel, no backhoe, just a strong back. And that's in front of Mr. Rose's grocery store. And of course beside that would be A&C Williams. And this is a picture probably taken in the 70s and 80s, and you see the different stores. The Picture World is where the print shop is today, and then of course there was a pool hall and I think maybe sandwiches and stuff. I think Joe Waddell ran that at one time, and then of course you've got Redmond's, the sports liner, and then Jacqueline Wedding, Jackie Candiday's beginnings in Franklin. And today those businesses are all gone. I hope some of y'all knew the Barkers. They were such great people. You'd go in at Western Auto, and they knew what you needed, and you were in and out in no time. But they had started out across the street where the rare prints are today, and then when R.C. Alexander moved down to Fifth Avenue with Harpeth Ford, then they moved across the street, and they had almost all you would need in the way of hardware or anything for lawnmowers or automobiles. But they were such friendly folks, and they are missed. This is kind of funny. Across the street was John M. Green's Insurance. Now this is senior. And Miss Agnes Bennett was kind of the novelty in town. She was probably one of the richest women in the county. She had farms everywhere. She was a granddaughter of Samuel Fielding Glass, who was probably the richest man after the Civil War. And she was very peculiar. And she was having her car worked on across the street and had an old Packard, and she really gunned it. And she jumped the street and went right through the door across the street and almost hit Mr. Green. Sadly, when I came to town, she was still living. She had two houses on 3rd Avenue and 3rd Avenue North, but she became ill, and she was in the nursing home for probably 30 years down the street here on 4th Avenue. So it's kind of sad. She had all that money and she wouldn't spend it. She was very miserly. The best story, Miss Nan Chapman was a mentor of mine, and she said she was on Main Street one day, and Miss Agnes came down and said, "Nan, what have you been doing?" And Nan says, "I'm making cherry preserves." And Miss Agnes said, "Oh, there's nothing better than hot biscuits and cherry preserves." But she said, "Nan, they're just too high to eat." The Gentrys tell about they were cousins, and she would come out for Christmas, and she would bring them a can of beans, or that was their Christmas gift. Here's a big tragedy. March the 2nd, 1981, the liquor store and the little cafe, probably the fire started, I think, maybe in the back. And you can see there, it did a lot of damage in the next picture. Bob and Jackie have moaned over this because a lot of the old negatives that they had gotten from the Dickerson photographer, who had taken a lot of pictures in the 40s and copied a lot of old photographs for people, all that went up in smoke. And of course, Mr. Will Redmond got burned pretty bad, and he had to give up the building. This is a wonderful parade, and we get to see on the other side of the street of the buildings that are there. Thomas McCall, before he was down on Fifth Avenue, was over here, like next to where the old Review Appeal office was. And then when those buildings were built on Fifth Avenue, he went over there and was there for many, many years. The Review Appeal Office, of course, was there. And you can see the Harpeth Bank was up on the corner. Across the street, you can see where this building was. The Hunter Buick was in that building, and Mrs. Sam Fleming bought that building and then redid this building to what it is today. Review Appeal, probably the oldest weekly paper in Tennessee, and Mr. George Armstead, and then his son Leonard, and then grandson Bill Armstead, and the father of, I think Bill Armstead Jr. is here today, or the third. But this is in their layout room, and of course Mr. Bearden and Whitfield and Mr. Porter, and of course Miss Robbie Huddleston. And she was, we're going to talk about her at the end, she was one of those, she was on Main Street for so long, and she was just a delight. You go in, she always had a smile. Okay, these are the buildings now, like where Red Pony is today, and Picture World, of course, was there, and then Walton's Jewelry, Dad and Lad, Friendly's Fashion, and then on the corner, what you see there, that building was Sandlin Drug, but it's already, thanks to Rudy and the DFA, we're going to see in this picture, this is the way it was when Sandlin left, and they went up, I think, to on the other side of Hills. But look what a ratty building that is. And thanks to Rudy was able to get the owner to agree to let's clean this building up. And I think she said he was willing to spend $200. Deweese Berry and Bo Stewart volunteered in the DFA, and they were taking down the sign, and they painted. I think she even got someone to donate the paint to really freshen the building up. And today the heirloom shop's been there, I think, ever since I've been to town. The old Harpeth National Bank, 1904, 1974, and you see the two buildings. The old building, then they put the marble siding on it, or slabs to cover it up, and then they moved up to the square. We'll see that. That building has been totally remodeled. But today we have Emmeline's and the Williamson County Visitor Center's offices are upstairs, and then on the side at 4th is where visitors go to get their information about the town. Pig and Peach, of course, was there. The last in the building, we'll see that. Mr. Sam Fleming worked as a young man at the Harpeth National Bank, and Mr. Freedman Hyde, who lived over on Bridge Street and apparently was a marvelous guy, Jesse Elmore, and then John Jordan Sr., who later became postmaster at one time, and then Minor McDaniel. Looks like a pretty interesting place to work, doesn't it? Bill Peach, I interviewed him a month ago, I guess, 2 months ago. He was on Main Street 52 years. He started out, he was a student at Hillsborough, and worked, his mother, of course, we're going to talk about her in a few minutes, worked at the dime store. And then, of course, Mr. Paul Pigg came from Columbia and set up a business. And here you see Joe Hardison worked there. And then Bill Peach worked there and then became a partner. And you see they've taken over the bank in '75. And then I think Bill, and I think, anyways, it was sold. The ice cream place was there for a while. How about this? This has probably had to be taken on a Saturday. Saturdays was a big day. All the people in the county came to Franklin to spend the day, and I mean they came to spend the day. Some of them brought their lunch, and they would really stay all day. and the streets were full of people. I've just found this today. In there, you're going to see I've made a mistake. I thought when I was working on the square that there had put up meters in front of the courthouse in 1941. I must have made a mistake because I was reading. I found this today. I've been reading the Review of Appeals, and I was into 1940. Well, I read 45 the other day and got into 47 today. And they're starting a parking law. And in 47, that's when they start charging 5 cents for an hour and a penny for 12 minutes. And that was still going on when I came in 70. But you see here in this picture, that's what made me question, well, apparently they were still angle parking in 42. This is one of my favorite buildings, the two buildings. They're kind of like sisters. They were built at the same time. But the corner of 4th and Main on that side of the street was very important. And I mentioned some of the stores that have been there over the years. Probably none of you all remember Franklin Bargain stores. It was a Pinkerton store in that picture in 1925. It was a furniture store, Mr. Rolfe Pinkerton. His father, or grandfather had Rolfe's, did plumbing and roofing and that kind of things back after the Civil War. And then, of course, you've got Zager's, which was a Jewish dry goods store. And then Brothers came in the 40s. And you've got the national stores were there for many, many years. And then next door, you had McClure's. Jan Aiken had the bridal shop there one time. And then even one picture, you've got Carrier Heating and Air. The Cellar, Janice Hughes had her business down in the basement of Peggy's place. And then just recently, Pyology has left. And today the green room is going to be moving in. They've been working and getting the room ready to open up, and I notice it's coming along. But that's an important site. And today Chico's and the green room are going to be occupying those two buildings. This is a 1970s view, and you can see starting there Lunn & Garner, Franklin Jewelry, Ben Franklin, Draper and Darwin, Great Drug, Jake's Barbershop, Robertson Green Insurance and Real Estate, Sparkman's Jeweler, and Standard Farm. That's a pretty good run. The National Store and McClure's were in those two buildings that we were talking about, and then we had Aki Bryant's store, he was a dry goods Jewish merchant, and then we had Lunn & Garner that you see here. McClure's came to Franklin in July of 1945, and where Lunn & Garner, there was a fire there in the 30s, and Mr. Walter Roberts owned that building, and he had it refaced with brick, and this is an Art Deco building very similar to, they were built about the same time as this building. And of course, Aki Bryant we're going to get to him in a minute. These are the workers, and I want to emphasize, these people worked for pennies an hour, and they were so faithful, because this was the only job in town for some of these ladies. The National Store, of course, was on the corner, and then McClure's. And I want to recognize two ladies that every time, I didn't go in the store very often, sometimes I walk in with Elaine, but Mrs. Clark and Mrs. Sharp were just delightful. They were sisters, McMillan sisters, and in the picture below there, we get to see what it was like. Unfortunately, I don't have the identification on those, but McClure's came here from Nashville, and they were very nice ladies' wear. This is a good picture because you get to see the McClure. We've got there the National Stores, and then you've got McClure's and Ike Bryant's store, and then the shoe store, Lund & Garner. Ike Bryant came here. I think he was Latvia. He was a Jew, and he died in 1960. And by that time, Franks had taken over his place. Lund & Garner was the old store on Franklin. Mr. Rainey Lund was, you can see there in the old building, and the guys. One of the things, Mr. Jimmy Gentry always talked about nicknames in Franklin, and there was one, the black guy that worked in there that sewed up the shoes was named Leroy Dufunny. And Leroy got caught. He was taking shoes and dropping them out the window, and then he would take them and sell them to some of his friends. And, I don't think he lost his job. I think they just made him pay for the shoes. Now, this is a wonderful scene in it. Mr. Jenkins came here and took over from Mr. Nugent came here first to start Nugent's, Ben Franklin, Five and Dime. Then Mr. Jenkins and his wife Ann came here, and you can see the Aiken family. You all know Damon and Jeannie and Pug. Bless her heart, she was a sweetie. And then Miss Ann and, of course, Gladys House. Even I remember going in and the big candy counter. It was very tempting to get a sample. And they would, always give the children a little something to keep them happy and maybe ask Mama to buy some candy from them. The Frank's Clothing is another store that's really been there. I always loved to go in. I knew all those people. And this picture tells you that there's Mr. Frank Beasley and Edna Mae Beard and Harold Stringer and Miss Hood and Miss Green. And then there were a bunch of ladies that worked upstairs, Liz Beard. They were just lovely folks to deal with. And then, of course, Ben Franklin next door. That became Ash. Mr. Ash bought that from Mr. Jenkins probably in the 70s. Sadly, in 1979, Ben Franklin caught on fire. And the county, the city, this is Rudy Jordan's information, was going to demand that the store owners tear down those buildings and build something in their place. And she got 3 structural engineers to come in and certify that those walls would stand to be rebuilt. And thank goodness they did, because can you imagine what a 1980 structure would look like in that? Now look at this today. It's not like a false tooth falling out, is it? It's kind of continuous. You've got buildings of different ages, but with the Art Deco and the Second Empire there, it works. We have today Chico's, the Green Room, the Cellar on Main, Heart and Hands, Hester Cook, Iron Gate. What is now where the cheese place is, I understand, Aubrey told me that Lee Kennedy with the Leaper's Fork Distillery is coming into that building. So it won't be vacant long. And of course the Cottage, Grey Drug Restaurant, Oh Be Joyful, the Image of God. That's a nice little children's store. That thing's only 8 feet wide, and that was the steps to get to the hallway and steps to get to the McEwen building, which was built in 1873. So it survived the fire. And then Savory Spice and F&M Bank. Any of y'all remember Miss Fanny Gebhardt? Her father was Dr. Ewing, and he ran a drugstore. He was an interesting man. He was a brother-in-law to Walter Roberts, and we're going to see here next. I know I've got to hurry up. Some of y'all need to get home. Walter Roberts was Mr. Main Street. He came here from Pulaski and married Sally Ewing and had 3 daughters. He was a prosperous man. He was involved in starting the Harpeth Bank. He was also an officer in the Williamson County Bank. And Mr. John Green told me, he said when his granddaddy left for Florida in the wintertime, no real estate was sold because he controlled the money and the property. And of course, Robert's store was the store. It was high-end. If you remember the Irwin girls and Martha Lilly lived down here on 4th, their father, Alex, was the manager for that store for years and years and years. And also his brother, Shara Irwin, as well. This is a good picture of that. I think 1904 they had a contest. The person that could bring in the most women to the store got 2 tickets to go to the World's Fair in St. Louis. And O.F. Williams is the one that won. This is an interesting, this is kind of in the center there. Mr. Joe Ball and Hardy Owen had a grocery store, but they also sold candy. You mentioned apparently there was more money in candy than there was selling flour and sugar. C.C. Brees is an interesting guy. He came here and stayed for 2 years, then he left and went to Clarksville, and then he came back and took another store. But this is the inside of his store. He was a pretty important guy because he was one of the few optometrists. He made your glasses, fitted you, and then also sold you china and wedding rings. And of course, this is inside Gray Drug. And these guys, that must have been fun working for Gray Drug. Miss Frances Hay, she got, I think that I got the picture from her. But here's the guys. I mean, this is just like Main Street Plus. John Moran was started the business, and then when he made enough money, he just retired. And he traveled the world. He'd go to Alaska, and he went to Egypt, and he would write back and describe his many trips. And of course, Mr. Frank Gray, Sr., and then we had Bilbo Miller, William Miller, and of course Mr. Ralph Duke, and then William Garrett. And these are the dates there of their time of service. But Mr. Duke, I think, was the last one there, and he was always out there at the front with the broom. He believed in keeping that sidewalk in front of his store clean. And then, of course, Jacobs, Jake's Barbershop, he started out on the other side of the street, and then when the opening came up on across the street, he moved there. And of course, you see Mr. Walter Ray, Albert Tomlin, Jim Gladney, and then of course Jake was up front. I think Dr. Gathman is in the chair with Jake, and then down here J.W. Little is in the chair with Walter Ray, and of course Papa Charlie Swanson was the boot black on shoe shine. And then in the next picture there, you see how it fits in. These are 2 views, 50 years apart in the same place. So you see Franklin has changed. E.B. Casey was Church of Christ minister, but he also was he was a silversmith, a watchmaker, and He married a lot of people in the county. If you read the papers, he's always going out to these country churches and preaching and marrying them. And then that's his son, who was a eye surgeon in Nashville. This is a great picture of Brees with that great clock out front. I cannot find what happened to it. But in the little building, there's Mr. Monroe Young was there at one time for a while when that picture was taken. And then On the other side of Brees's is, of course, Pointer hardware store, and we're going to see that. This was a building that was built by John McEwen, and it burned in '73, and then the Pointers built back the building. It burned in that building burned in '25, and he built the building. What's there today we see was in '26. Many of y'all don't know, maybe Clem Blackburn had the jewelry store there first, and then Mr. Sparkman was in the dry cleaning business, and he got out of that, and he bought the Franklin Jewelry Store from Miss Howard, and then moved in Liam Blackburn's store. And then, of course, we've got what is today the F&M Bank, but it was the Pointer Building, Standard Farm for many years. Mr. Joe Trice and Reynolds was there for many years in this building, and then they sold, or Joe Trice sold to the Standard Farm store, and then later Mr. W.A. Moore bought from them, and of course it was in that was another sweet spot, being on the corner of the square. And then of course this is a picture taking, the Tip Top Cafe was above the store, and it was a tea room, and at the time the Chamber of Commerce and those kind of buildings, I think maybe even the early Rotary Club met there. And of course you can see the streets, the drugstore, Grey Drug down the block. And again, here's the Franklin High Band in '46. That's, I think, a great scene. And then, of course, this is Main Street. And we have to give our hats off tonight, I think, to the DFA. They were the engine behind Main Street and streetscape that we have. And you can see those two photographs show that Franklin needed something. And we can thank, there's some people here tonight that we can thank for this, because Rudy is here, and John is here, and Calvin is here. Is Ed Silva here? He said he was coming. And of course, unfortunately, Barbara and Lonnie are no longer with us. But can you imagine what Franklin Main Street would look like without what they did? And again, that's an example. A small group of people has to make it work. And that's been Franklin's key. They've had a small group of people that were workers. And I'm giving hats off tonight. Mary could not be with us. She's down in Clarksdale, Mississippi. She left today. She was going to stay until see this and go, but she needed to get on. And so I told her we'd recognize her. But we're saying that Rudy and Mary, you had the DFA and the Heritage Foundation working together. And it's these two ladies, their fingerprints are all over what you see today down these 4 blocks of Franklin. Not only did they have drive, but they were committed, and they got it done. They were able to work with business people, the Board of Aldermen, and then they had good helpers behind them. The Heritage Foundation has always had some great board members, and the DFA have had workers, usually people who were business people, and many of them owned the buildings. I'm picking out 3 people that need to be recognized. Every town has their characters. And I said this at one meeting some time ago, and then someone saw me and said, "Well, Rick, you're a character." So I'm going to accept that. But Robert McLemore, Spare Dime as he was known, Fred Buford, was a friendly guy. He was just all over town. He was the man about town. And then everybody talks about Papa Charlie. And he was a giant of a man. He could pick up a refrigerator and walk it off. But he was just a friendly guy. And I recognize those because they were on Main Street. They were the characters that made Main Street, gave it some fun. And now I want to look at the notable men who worked on Main Street. Many of them owned businesses. Woody Dickerson was a photographer that came here in the 40s. E.E. Byers was president of the Williamson County Bank. Rusty Wilkerson had the furniture store and then went into the hardware business. Mr. Sparkman, of course, had the cleaners, and then he got into the jewelry store. And here's a guy that don't get enough recognition, and that's Mr. Sims. Wayne worked at the national stores, and then when I knew him, he was at the Pig and Peach store. Mr. Fletcher Wilson operated a shoe store, and of course, I just pulled out some of the men from the bank, but Fulton, Fuller Arnold, of course, was a character, but he was also a banker who probably did some deals for people that he knew they were good, but maybe the board may not have thought that they could pay, but he did. And of course, Mr. Stuart Campbell, he was president of the Harpeth Bank, really into a lot of business in Franklin and also later Nashville. And of course, Harry Isaacs, he was famous. He was a great artist. And every election across the street was the Review Appeal office, and they would project onto a sheet across the street the tally for the election. And it was about, the street was full. And today, we watch it on television, but back then people didn't have television. So to be in the crowd and wait to see who was going to win county judge. And he was the artist. And of course, Rudy Knight, Draper and Darwin. Here's some more. Fulton Greer was also in the Harpeth Bank. Joe Pinkerton was in the Harpeth Bank, and then he went over to be vice president and later president of the Williams County Bank. Mr. Billy Walker, what a gentleman. He was just so kind. He and his brother operated with their mother. And then, of course, what would Hardcastle be without Mr. Stevenson? And, of course, Winder McGavick. If you look in the deeds, when I tried to look up property and I see Winder McGavick or Walter Roberts, they had property, they were trading all over town, so makes it difficult to trace a piece of property. Curtis Green, Oscar Godwin, Mr. Henry Mayberry, and of course Cecil Vines was the projectionist here and there, and then of course I had to put down John M. Green. This guy was a gentleman. He had more influence on the youth of Franklin than probably any other person besides maybe Jimmy Gentry and Bobby Gentry. But we're getting close. Miss Walker, she ran that company. She was, I bet, a real taskmaster. And of course, Miss Sandlin had Sandlin Drug. Barbara Kirtland, of course, had the goodies down the way, and she was a sweetheart. Ewing Vaughn took up tickets here, and then later she was a clerk down at the Williams County Bank. And, of course, Miss Howard and Gail tonight couldn't be here because of COVID, but her mother was a business person, and then, of course, Julia Isaacs, Bootsy Hoover, Miss Ruby Alexander, Lou Wilkerson, Margaret Meacham with Harpeth Insurance. Miss Jackson worked at Beasley's for many, many years. And of course, Miss Agnes Potts, her nephew's here tonight. I'm glad to see that. But she was over the Western Union here in town. And of course, Lucille Lawrence worked all her days for Mr. C.C. Breese, and then later she stayed on with the Howards. Pack Roberts' mother, Kate, worked in many of the grocery stores. Miss Marlin, of course, was at the Review Appeal. And a sweet lady was Miss Sweeney. She was a Gatlin, Virginia, and she was always had a bright smile on her face at the bank. Miss Robbie Huddleston, we've talked about her, and of course, the next every time you walked into the Harpeth Bank, you could always see my eyes are Miss Tyndall. I'm sorry, I almost forgot that. And of course, Virginia White. And Lavinia Redford, and I put Lavinia in there because she worked her whole working career for Ike Bryant at the store. Now, here are the couples that worked together as teammates and made their businesses work at the variety store, which was next door, and then it went down the street to the Harrison building. But Mr. Charlie and his wife, she did alterations and was a dressmaker. Of course, the Friensleys had Dad and Lad. We've talked about Bob and Jackie Candaday, and what we would do without them is their collection of photographs, which are now at the Williamson County Historical Archives. And Bill Peach and Emily and Christine, who has just turned 100 recently, and Mr. Paul Pigg, and of course, what would Franklin be like without Marilyn and Calvin Lahue? I'm closing up with these ladies that I knew some of them. They represent the young girls that came to town and worked for pennies. This is the Rose Dime Store bunch. The manager didn't trust them, so he had them sew up their pockets so they couldn't put anything in them. What kind of atmosphere is that? This is one of the great pictures taken in 1965 of Franklin, and this is kind of the way I remember it when I came to town. Telephone poles, the signs were terrible. It was not a very pleasant place. This is the way I'd like to remember Franklin. This is a 1934 view. You see Chapman's Pie Wagon. But I got a feeling this has been doctored because you don't see any telephone poles and you don't see the in-urban that went around the square. And you know, it's 8:30 and it's time to go home.